time, even in play. And I remember the time I clapped twice at dinner, and my mother flinched so hard she knocked over her wine glass, and the stain on the tablecloth was never washed out, just folded away like it hadn't happened. And afterward she told me, with that same smile that didn't reach her eyes, that some sound were not meant for our ears, and I nodded as I always did, and never clapped again. And every Sunday we'd walk past the bell tower after church, and someone, usually grandfather, would pause and remove his hat, not with reverence but with warning, like the tower deserved not worship but wariness. And sometimes I thought I heard something inside, not a bell's call, but something more primal, a metallic hum just beneath the silence, and I'd feel it in my stomach before I heard it in my ears, and I'd press my hand to my belly and tell no one, and the tower remained just that, a relic, a mystery, a structure that loomed in every family story and yet featured in none directly, always adjacent to grief, never its source. And as I grew older, I learned to accept its presence the way one accepts a scar on a face they love. You stop seeing it, you stop questioning it, until one day someone points and you remember, and it comes back all at once. And I remember the games we played as children, hide and seek, that always ended too early if someone strayed. Too close to the tower's door, tag that veered sharply away from its base, and how the ground beneath it was always damp, even in drought, and no one ever commented on it. And I remember how my cousin Thomas used to whisper that the bell had rung once, long before we were born, and that something was taken that day. And I remember how the adults would say things like, "We don't speak of the tower," and "Some stories are too heavy for small hearts," and how we accepted that silence because we were taught that to question it was disloyalty, and loyalty in this family was currency. And then there was a day the stonemason came, years later, when I was maybe 11, to inspect the tower supports, and afterward he went white as paper and left without billing, and no one ever spoke of it again. But the next morning the chapel door was locked and grandfather's voice was unusually hoarse, and I began to notice the absences, not of people, but of moments, conversations that stopped when I entered, pages torn from books and study, names not listed in family records, photographs with faces scraped just slightly out of focus. And the older I got, the more I understood that this wasn't a house built on wealth or bloodlines, but on careful omission, and the tower was its monument. And sometimes at night, when the manor creaked with age and the wind made the windows weep, I'd hear vibration in the walls, subtle but unmistakable, like the pull of breath before a scream, and I would pull the covers over my head and whisper the family's bedtime mantra. Sleep quiet, wake proud, and never climb. And that mantra stayed with me long after I left, tucked in the corners of my thoughts like lint you can never quite shake loose. And I thought I had forgotten the tower, thought I had outgrown the house and its silent heart. But standing beneath it now, adult and fractured, I understand it was never about forgetting, it was about keeping it buried. And now that I've returned, now that the old stone looms once more above me, I see clearly that the tower did not sleep all those years. It watched and it waited, and it held its breath for someone foolish or desperate enough to break the silence. And I, God help me, might be the first one ready to listen. The portrait gallery had always been the coldest room in the manor, not because of draft or shadow, but because it held the most eyes, eyes that seemed to breathe as you passed them, eyes that tracked not out of malice, but from a place deeper, a place where memory fermented into obligation. And I hadn't stepped foot inside since the week of my grandfather's funeral, when the floor still smelled of polished oak, and everyone's grief was performed like theater, soft words and rigid postures, and someone, I don't remember who, had drawn the curtains and said, "Let the ancestors see us mourn," as if the painted faces lining those walls could grant absolution if they were offered enough polite pain. And now, returning, as an adult with years of distance and suspicion under my belt, I stepped into that room and was immediately gripped by a familiarity I hated, that itchy, crawling sensation of being recognized by things that shouldn't know your name. And I stood just inside the threshold, letting my eyes adjust, and felt the air go still, like the room inhaled and refused to exhale. And the first painting I approached was of a woman I had forgotten I remembered, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked carved, her lips a straight line, her hands folded in her lap with fingers long and bony, and beneath her was a brass plaque that read, Ginevra Vexley, 1864 to 1912. And I knew that name, not from story but from whispers, from the way older relatives would mutter in passing, and then pretend they'd said something else. And I leaned closer and realized her eyes, painted in traditional deep brown of all Vexleys, were off subtly, the irises just slightly asymmetrical, like the artist hadn't wanted to paint her directly. And I move on to the next, a man with sharp shoulders and a rifle propped casually against his leg. His gaze turned just enough to seem indifferent, and I saw that his plaque had been scratched, the name illegible, and I paused, frowned, ran my finger over it, and felt grooves, deliberate and angry, and further down the row. There were more, portraits where the names were either missing, altered, or clearly re-engraved in a different style, and something about that rattled me. Because the Vexleys prided themselves on legacy, on order, and here was a fracture, a scar left visible because to remove the painting entirely would raise questions, and I started to catalog them, naming those I could, Theodoric, Estelle, the twins who died in infancy, and noting those I could not, until I reached the final stretch, the wall of the silenced, as I began to call in my mind, where 5 portraits stood in a row, each with matching frames, each subject young, no, older than 20, and each will look not a stillness but a shock of just buried fear beneath practiced expression. And the one in the center, God, the one in the center was her, Aurelia, my cousin, my almost sister, who vanished when I was 14, gone with no funeral, no obituary, just a tight-lipped family meeting and a reassigning of her bedroom to storage. And there she was, immortalized, lips pressed into something almost a plea, her left eye fraction larger than the right, like she hadn't sat still or the artist had captured something too real. And her plaque simply read AV, as if even 3 syllables were too much acknowledgement. And I reached out, fingertips grazing the frame, and the wood was warm, warmer than it should have been. And I pulled back instinctively, heart thudding, and it hit me all at once. These weren't portraits made of honor. They were containment, visual graves, a gallery of names and faces held in stillness, so no one would ask where the bodies were. And I stepped back, dizzy, eyes scanning the room with new awareness, seeing how many plaques it smudges, how many names have been shortened to initials. And I thought of the tower, its silence, its height, and wonder if it was less a beacon and more a lid, pressing down on a family that had too many stories and not enough endings. And I whispered Aurelia's name, just once, and the light in the room shifted, subtly, a cloud moving outside, or perhaps nothing at all. But the room felt smaller, denser, and I turned and left without looking back. But the eyes followed, and I understood then that I had not come here to remember. I had come here to retrieve, and the tower was not the only structure meant to hold the past, and maybe, just maybe, it was time one of us learned how to listen to the silence painted into every corner of this cursed house. Dinner at the Vexley Manor was never about food, though the dishes were exquisite, plated with precision that bordered on surgical, with silver forks aligned so neatly they could have passed inspection by a jeweler. It was about order, about the performance of unity under scrutiny. And from the time I was old enough to sit at the long oak table, I understood instinctively that noise was a kind of crime, that the clinking of cutlery or the scrape of a chair drew eyes, and not the soft kind, but eyes that held judgment like a weight pressing behind the forehead. And every dinner began the same, with silence, an unbroken 5-minute ritual before the first bite, during which no one prayed, no one spoke, no one moved, except for grandfather, who would clear his throat at the end, not loudly, just enough to shift the room from stillness into motion. And that sound was our chime, our substitute for what the bell tower refused to do. And as a child, I thought it was strange, theatrical even. But as I grew older, I saw it for what it was, control, a mechanism that replaced spontaneity with structure. And over the years, I noticed how certain topics were never raised, how laughter was permitted, only in half measures, and how each conversation skirted too closely to memory before veering hard into banal, whether charity events, livestock auctions, renovations. And I remember one night, years ago, when my cousin Lionel asked why the bell tower had a rope inside if no one ever rang it, and the entire table fell so quiet you could hear the candle wax drip, and grandmother smiled with teeth too bright and said, "Because some sound belonged to history, darling," and no one corrected her, though the tension was so thick I felt it wrap around my throat like a scarf. And Lionel was sent to bed early that night, his dessert untouched, and I never saw him at the table again, though they claimed he went to a boarding school in Switzerland. And when I asked later which one, my mother simply said, "He'll write when he can," and he never did. And so dinners continued night after night, year after year, with chairs that stayed full until they didn't, with faces that vanished from, portraits and memory in equal measure, and still no one spoke of the bell, not during wine, not over dessert, not even when thunder struck so close to the house that the windows trembled and the tower looked for a moment like it might crack. And I remember the night grandfather died, the way no one cried, not even my mother, how the servants laid out the best linens, and the family doctor spoke in circles, and the bell did not toll, not once, though the tradition in town was to ring once for each decade of life, and he had lived nearly 9. And when I asked why we hadn't sounded it, and Evangeline leaned close and whispered, "The dead know their silence." And that phrase stuck with me, wormed into my mind until I began to wonder if silence was less a family trait and more contagion, something inherited by breath and blood. And now, sitting alone at that same table, my fingers tracing the grooves worn into the wood, I felt the absence of those old rituals like a phantom limb, and the stillness press against me with the weight of memory. And I saw them all again. Grandmother's stiff smile, Uncle Harris's half blink before swallowing each mouthful like a stone, Aurelia's fingers tapping her napkin in secret rhythm, Lionel's eyes darting toward the window, as if he could see the tower of his place. And I realized that the bell had been present all along, not in sound, but in the restraint it demanded, the fear encoded in our bodies. And it wasn't just a tower, it was a metronome for suppression, and now I knew. The reason it had never rung was because it already did, every night, inside us, calibrated to our silences, and I stood slowly, the chair legs echoing sharp against the tile, and whispered, "Why didn't you ever scream?" And the air didn't answer, but the chandelier above me flickered just once, and I knew that somewhere in this house, the silence had heard me, and something, whatever still listened from behind the stone, had begun to stir. The tower door was never meant to open, not because it lacked a key or hinge, but because it was, in every sense that mattered, not a door at all, but a seal, a final punctuation mark placed at the end of the sentence no one was allowed to reread. And yet there I was, standing before it with the old brass ring clutched in my hand, the one I found inside the false panel of my grandfather's desk beneath a hidden ledger labeled structural accounts, West Wing and Bell Room, and the key didn't just fit, it clicked with the precision of a clock winding back time, and as I turned it, slowly, every muscle in my back taut with the weight of what I might find, the lock grown open like a throat clearing after decades of silence, and I pushed the heavy wooden door and felt it resist me, not mechanically, but with something almost sentient, like the wood itself had grown used to being forgotten, and the air that spilled out was dry, dust-laced, and cold, not the cold of stone, but of paper, the kind of air that carries the smell of mildew and secrets. And the first thing I saw was not the bell, but a stairwell spiraling upward into shadow, and I climbed it without thinking, each step creaking not under my weight, but under the strain of memory returning. And when I reached the landing, I expected open space, a vast chamber with rope and clapper, but what I found instead was a storage room, meticulously organized, every shelf stacked with black ledgers, some dating back to the late 1800s, their covers cracked, spines flaking, all of them labeled with initials and dates and columns upon columns of handwritten entries. And I pulled one at random and scanned it, heart thudding louder with every line. Payments to tradesmen for discreet labor, fees. To distant institutions for behavioral relocation. A staggering entry labeled August 1921. Silencing compensation approved, and my blood went cold, because that was the same month one of the portraits in the gallery had been quietly removed and replaced with a still life, and I rifled faster now, fingers dirtying with soot and ink, and found dozens more. Child S, removed from roster, Aurelia V adjustments made per directive, B